Let's get into some detail, and that detail that I want to get into here is looking at the day-to-day activities that we carry out if we're going to facilitate the risk management processes for people. I'm going to use the Prince process model here. I could actually have said I'm going to use the PMBok process model here because the two are so close together as to be indistinguishable really. And what I want to talk us through is, and what I want to link us to, is that there is some good guidance in the textbooks, and what we need to be working our way through is a structured and sequential way in which we identify how we're going to manage risk. That's plan the process, and then identifying what risks we need to concern ourselves with, sizing them, prioritizing, determining the options, taking actions, and then you repeat that whole process, which in PMBok terms is process 11.6, and then having repeated that, we eventually get to the position where we can close out the risks that we have been managing because we've gone past them, or they have happened, or as a project, program or portfolio, the activities that we're responsible for are passing on to other people, so we hand over what's left. So there is a day-to-day element of control, and we cannot escape the fact that that's about handling what you can and escalating what you can't. So what we've got here is project controls day to day, and that work carries on at the level of control unless it needs to be escalated into the management activities. And the labels that I'm using here, CS and DP, are controlling a stage and directing a project. So that's the project manager day to day and the sponsor. You don't need to use the Prince labels, but if we're going to talk about managing in project contexts, let's use the labels and the vocabulary that's familiar in some circumstances. Even if you've no intention of ever going and getting any qualifications, it's good to be able to speak the lingo. So we start with, we start with planning, but we start the activity with somebody spots a cause or a consequence which leads to some condition that we care about. In fact, the reality as we get into it, we will discover is mostly people spot a concern like we might be late. And you say, okay, well, that's a consequence. What might be the causes of it? So my day-to-day activity is we spot some fragment of a risk. And the first thing that we need to do to progress that, as I said to you earlier, is the secret sauce of identify is establish a good full description, and that will take some workshops and maybe some work on whiteboards and shared workspaces, and get your Skype shared desktop or whatever other tool you use, and we create entries into a risk register or a risk log, which is really just a backlog of things that we might want to do something about in the future. So my first bit of day-to-day control is I've got a log of risks, and at some point or another I'll either run a workshop or somebody will come to me and say I'm awfully worried about or look how attractive this is, and I will log into the register. Now later I'm going to say that you can make a mountain out of a molehill with logging stuff to registers, so I will do the documentary bit, but it's not my primary focus. You're not going to manage what you can't remember, and there's enough in projects that shared team memory needs memory aids, and post-it notes stuck on a whiteboard or entries made in an Excel spreadsheet give us memory. But we're not doing this stuff just to write it down. We're writing it down in order that we don't forget it. We're not finding it so we can write it down and then say because it's in some register somewhere we'll be mightily protected, because we won't. So having established a full description, or having actually started with a fragment, what we want to do is do an assessment, baseline assessment of the impact. And that means looking at our backlogs and our forecast plans and asking questions like, how does this affect the investor's business proposal, for example, the net present value, or what other form of benefits they are pursuing? So we think of the consequences of that condition and from its causes and its consequences, and how that affects our milestones, our benefits, in fact the total value case and the total cost case that the project is exposed to. And we may update our records. We certainly need our records updated at some time. And then that goes forwards to the more strategic consideration of what business impact, what tactical actions can I take to reroute around the problem or to capitalize on the opportunity. And again, I get actions that are identifiable here, and those identified actions and how they impact on the value the project will deliver get updated. At that point, I am ready now to make a decision about what responses do I want to implement and which ones might I leave to the future or just put entirely to one side. But it may be that those decisions are outside of my authority. They may be outside of my expertise. So having got this far, the next thing I need to do is consider the escalation mechanism. That is to say, decision making by customer and or supplier at the appropriate level of authority, which is why I have it spanning from the blue day-to-day control into the grey of management oversight and considerations, or leadership and sponsorship considerations. So we're going to talk about later. We're going to go through all of this stuff later in the detail of how do you do it, but this is about escalating risks and indeed issues through the mechanisms by which the organisation gives us guidance. Now, at this point, we may be able to make the decisions that are needed, or the escalation will have resulted in the decisions that are needed. And so the outcomes from that decision making may be, well, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's not take action now. So accept it for now. And that action there may be because we've done some of the other actions I'm about to share with you. It may be that we don't properly understand what it is that's concerning us. So ask for clarification and amendment. We're going to go back to the considerations, both strategic and tactical, about how will this affect the business case and what could we do about it. For example, it might be that we've just seen a bigger opportunity than we recognised, but that requires a little bit more investment and we're not clear how that's going to work. So we go off and we clarify, in which case we then come back through the processes to make the decision again as to what to do next. Now, the decision may be, no, this threat isn't enough to concern me. I'm going to continue to take no action. Or it might be that this opportunity is not sufficiently attractive, so I'm not going to take any action, in which case I reject it. It might be that I'm going to respond to the consequence. I'm going to do something to make the impact bigger or smaller, and so I'm going to take some actions, and I'm going to put those actions in my project plan or into the team's backlogs, into the team's action plans, into people's to-do lists. So now we're going to update our forecast schedule and our value case for the actions that we're taking. Now, it may be that the actions that I'm going to take about consequences are perhaps things to soften a blow for a threat that I might decide, well, I wonder if I could stop the event or the impact ever occurring. So I might take actions that respond to the cause. So important point to note here, when we consider a risk, the reason we wanted in identify was to have a full description of the causes leading to a condition that has consequences, is because I will separately consider causes and consequences as things I can take action against. In all cases, I'm going to do my appropriate record keeping, update the log, the backlog, that is the backlog of risk, the risk register, and update the forecast for what all the dynamics of the project, like cost, schedule and benefits are. So there's the process. That's the background of my thinking all the time, although in reality all these different processes are potentially going on simultaneously with different people on the same day, but any one risk will flow through this process. The start of that process is over here when we spot a cause leading to a condition with consequences, and that's most often discovered as a result of consciously holding a risk planning workshop. So let's have a brief thumbnail sketch of what one of those might look like. I'll frequently run risk planning workshops when I'm in my project. The start and end of everything is a good opportunity to say, let's have a considered discussion about risk. Now that requires that we have much greater understanding of awareness than I've given you so far, and these things like risk management strategy and awareness here are links. So if I click on one, it takes me through to what's the awareness picture, and I'll take you through that later. And the U-shaped button here in PowerPoint, HTML5, etc. will take me back to where I was. That won't work in PDF. PDF is, I think it's Control Alt left arrow. So the first thing that we need is awareness. All good risk management starts by everybody who's involved being aware of what the scales are, how the risk process works, who has what roles, etc. So we've got some work to do on that. But when I run an awareness workshop, or when I create awareness, I often do that through running workshops, and I'll circulate the results from that workshop as a reference, and we might call that the risk management policy or the risk management strategy or just the risk management plan. The way that I'm going to run that is I'm going to invite relevant attendees, and webcam based remote working works perfectly well for most of that. What is important is that I get the sponsor involved, because one of the things I'm going to do in the initial planning workshop is define scales, and when we define scales we need to understand where people go ouch versus don't care, or where people go wow that's good versus don't care, and that is almost impossible to do without discussion, and so you need the right people there. I might go have a conversation with sponsor separately outside of the risk planning workshop, but that in its own right is something that if they're not going to be present at the risk planning workshop, then I'm going to put that in my risk register as risk number one. Although politically I might have to be careful about how I word that. We do need to keep people on side, but having a sponsor at the risk planning workshop in order that we can get the scales defined is a make or break. It's a success factor, and it's a failure compromise. So we're going to invite the right attendees. We'll get them sat around the table, or actually better yet stood at the whiteboard if it's physically together, or with their video cameras on and a shared workspace if we're doing it virtually. And our purpose here is to create the risk management strategy. I'll take you through what policy and strategy is later. I'm not going to do that right now, but it's coming. And what we're going to do here is explain the process diagram that I've just gone through in the previous slide with you. We're going to share what the right format for a good risk description is. That's this bit over here. Causes, conditions and consequences. We'll come back to this because it's a much more complex topic than just that. And we are going to debate and agree some risk scales which, if they're to be meaningful, will have gut feel, visceral, meaningful understanding for people, so that when we talk about a severe impact in a cost sense, or a moderate impact in a schedule sense, we will have understanding shared between ourselves as to what we mean by that. And that very, very rarely means numbers. It means descriptive statements. We'll also, in this planning workshop, agree how stuff gets done. So who does what? So we'll agree the roles, the procedures, and crucially, the escalation points or the authorities. So workshop is going to run through a bunch of steps, but now we know who's in attendance and what the purpose is. So the workshop steps will be agree the risk statement format. There are a few of them, but I really think there's only one principle behind this, and you can then word it how you like after that. But there is a risk that causes, note it's plural, result in condition with impacts or consequences. So I'm going to use impact and consequence interchangeably, meaning the same thing, I think, all the time. And I'll use event or cause, but they're not the same, because events tend to be things that happen quickly, and not all risk causes are immediate. Some of them are gradual onset, and that will create new problems for us in risk management, as I will talk to you about later. So what we're going to end up with: causes leading to condition having consequences, and the plurals are important here, and you've got a decision to make about how you're going to record your risks. And this is my recommended approach, which is for each condition we consider that to be a risk, and then we consider the multiple causes that could give rise to it and the multiple consequences that flow from it. Now, you're not going to get that in any other textbook that I know of. They're going to talk about a single event with a single impact, and that's just completely unrealistic. In fact, causes plural leading to condition with consequences plural is still too simplistic for reality, because different consequences are seen by different people in different ways. So we may have a single consequence, like project is delayed, and all your contract staff think yippee because their contracts are extended, where your investor thinks that that's very bad because now their costs are escalating. So if we're going to manage risks, that is to say conditions, we're going to need to understand consequences from different stakeholder perspectives. So we'll have to get into that later. I'm just trying to give you an overview at the moment. We're going to create our statements and our scales, that is to say, and our scales probably aren't just high, medium and low, but that's a very, very good starting point. So we'll create scales for high, medium and low, perhaps very high, very, very low, etc. I'll have some discussion with you about 2, 3, 4, 5 point scales. You can have 10 and 20 point scales if you want. They are difficult to make meaningful, but they do have their places. And we'll need a scale for cost, for scope, for quality, for benefits. We might even break a benefit scale into things like benefit size and benefit speed of arrival. So scales is going to be a conversation that we'll have to have quite a lot of exploration of. We'll agree our role holders and what their authorities are, how risks are identified and described, how actions are assigned to people, how the records are maintained, and indeed what records we want to keep, and within those records what are the component parts. For example, how record keeping is maintained, I've already partly said to you, but anyone can create a risk fragment at any point in time, like we might be late and stick it in the risk register. What we will say later is that that's fine to raise awareness of a concern. It's not any good for processing that concern through to useful actions. These things in total, the risk planning workshops total outputs, are establishing our routine or cadence. So what happens on a routine basis, what happens every Monday or every time we get to the end of a work package, or each sprint review, or when we go off and groom the product backlog, how do we think about risk and what do we do as a routine? So some aspects of project risk management are routine. It's a Monday, we do this. It's end of sprint, we do this. And others are event based. It's end of sprint, something's gone wrong, etc. So on discovery of fragment, that should be properly expanded into being a statement that is then assessed and prioritized. And that takes us into things like identification workshops, and through identification workshops to assessment activities. So let's go and have a look at those now. Now, it's very likely that risk identification is done by consciously pulling people together to share a discussion at the same time, where the purpose and the title is risk identification. So this is probably best done by a facilitator, and facilitators need to be responsive, and they need to recognize that they are running the process not to such a same degree, if indeed at all, contributing content. In order to be a responsive facilitator, I'll go through some qualities in a minute, but it is important to recognise that as facilitator, your job there is to encourage others to contribute, not to dominate the discussions yourself. So we're going to invite investors, owners of baselines, so people who have resources or budgets or are responsible for delivering against agreements, suppliers, subject matter experts. It's also sensible to have somebody who doesn't know the topic area because they'll ask the innocent questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the project's potential for things to go better or worse than expected in a number of different dimensions. So, for example, the business case. What could happen that would promote larger benefits or delay the delivery of delay the production of deliverables and thus delay benefits? We may talk about that in terms of major deliverables or epics, and we might use the epic user story or the boulder, rock, gravel analogy. We might do our identification by skill groups. We might get all our electrical engineers or all our software developers or all of our marketing people together and do things within some domain area. It's typically sensible to work by subject matter area plus one person, as I just said, who isn't a subject matter expert. And all risk identification is about brainstorming. It's about idea creation techniques. And we'll go through a bunch of brainstorming techniques and guidance and the like when we get somewhat further ahead. Slide 57 that was. This is number 9. So we'll talk about how we do this stuff later in detail. Let's for now carry on through the what does the cadence look like within the project on a day-by-day and a week-by-week basis. I said I'd expand what I meant by responsive, and the first thing that responsive is you write down the contributions that people make, or indeed if you're running a virtual workshop with a shared collaboration space, then you make it very clear at the beginning to people how they use the tools that allow them to put contributions onto the screen, onto the page, and you encourage people when they say things to write it down. And if they don't write it down on your shared space, then you write it down on the shared space. And the purpose of the responsive facilitator is not to debate and particularly not to argue with people's contributions. It's to record them and ask other people whether they have new contributions to make or whether they would comment on existing contributions. Now, when it's identification, the comments that we want are expansions and additions, not challenge. So if somebody challenges something and says, I don't think that's correct, then we'll say, well, that's a fine point to make, but not yet. If you don't think it's correct, please tell me what is correct. I'm not going to remove what's been said that you think's wrong, but I am going to record what you think correct would look like. And when we get to the end, we will assimilate, we will correlate, we will link everything together. And if at that point it deserves to be crossed out, we'll do that neatly by just transferring it into the register with a note that says this isn't going any further. So item number 1 of being a responsive facilitator is to record what people say or to provide the mechanism by which they can record as we go. Also, being the facilitator means that you need to explain that the session's structure, and then you need to follow that structure, but not dogmatically. If people appear to be going off at a tangent, give them a little bit of room to run first of all, and then if it's running too far, then ask the question, is that how are we coming back to the topic in hand? But dogma against an agenda, generally speaking, it pisses people off and they stop contributing as much. So we want a degree of flexibility, but we need structure and we want to get through stuff in the time available. And that again is helped if we have a bit of structure. Periodically we should summarize, and we should allow people to sit without making lots of contributions. We should ask the people who make lots of contributions to slow down and wait for other people to speak first, and we should ask the people who aren't contributing without being prompted, do you have a contribution to make yet? And we should allow them to say no, because otherwise we discourage them from wanting to come to our sessions in the future. Now, there's been a bit of an elephant in the room in terms of this slide. All the way through here I have had this bit on the slide down here which has 3 keys around it. It's in much bigger font than everything else, and it's got a yellow highlight, so hopefully you'll have worked out that I think that bit's important. And that is that when we run a risk identification workshop, our target is to get as many concerns or causes or consequences as possible. We will, before we're finished, have created a well-structured description of our risks, but the route to that is to accept everything you can get in whatever state it arrives in. So it's not about being neat and tidy as you go. It's about receiving as much as possible and then tidying it up later. So workshop steps. We've invited the right folk, they've turned up, we've said to them this is the structure, these are the roles perhaps that people are holding, and we ask people to identify independently things they're concerned about. Now that bit can be done at the opening of the workshop, or it could have been done offline in the call to meeting. Please come to the meeting, virtually or physically, with as many concerns identified as you can manage, and people might turn up with 1, 3 or 30. You might set a limit or a lower limit, like please ensure that you turn up with 10. In my experience 6 is normally a reasonable number, but some people have no problem with 30, other people have a problem with 3. What we're seeking to do here is get people to think independently. So the aim at the first step is to think independently, but then we're going to get people to share, and in sharing what we want them to do is read them out aloud, and we're going to record them to our central visible accessible pool. And what we're doing now is creating the possibility for people to generate synergy. So I thought of a whole bunch of risks, combination of concerns about causes and consequences, some of which were positive and some of which were negative. And when we get into the session, I find mine are quite different from other people's. So now everybody else's thinking is stimulating me to think of new stuff. So I'm going to ask individuals to share their lists that were generated without cross-fertilizing or polluting each other's thinking, and then I'm going to ask individuals to share new fragments based on what's just been shared, in which case I now expect their thinking to have been adjusted because they've heard everybody else's ideas. So the aim here is to cross-fertilize. So aim in step 1 is to not pollute each person's thinking with other people's thinking, because we then get groupthink, but the aim in step 2 is then to use that groupthink to be derogatory, but use those synergies so that we get a deeper and broader pool of risks. And then when we've got that first couple of lists of items, then we're going to ask the group to link causes to conditions and conditions to consequences. And by the time we're finished, every cause should be linked to the condition it creates, and every condition should be described with the consequences that arise. And we'll quite often find a cause creates a condition, the consequence of which is the cause of a new concern. So there's likely to be some chains in there. If you've done stuff on a shared collaboration space, I hope it's one where you can pick up bits of text and move them around. Obviously, if that's a whiteboard or a wall in an office somewhere and you've used these sorts of yellow sticky things, then that's fairly easy to move stuff around. A small piece of advice there is that when you peel the post-it notes off, peel them off sideways so they don't curl. If you peel them off this way round, they curl, and then half an hour after you've stuck them on something, they fall off. And that gets to be rather frustrating. So we will want, as the last stage of the risk identification workshop, no, not the last stage, I'll come back to that in a second, we'll want to move our risks around, or our fragments around, so we can put them into chains or nets. Now, it's quite probable that in doing that, people will think of new concerns, new fragments. So actually, I think the risk workshop wants to run step 1, step 2, step 3, step 1, step 2, step 3. And if you go through around that process twice, then that's good. Going through it more than twice might be just too much time, really. So I suggest that that you loop round probably twice, 10 times if you've got the stamina and the capability, and you record results either as you go through the workshop or when you get to the end, in which case if you're doing it on a physical wall, taking pictures with a snapping with your phone so that it's easy to then go and type stuff into some sort of tool, Excel perhaps, is a good way of working. So I'm just going to come back to the most important point here. It's have the right people and generate volume, because what we'll then do is analyze it in the next step. So let's go and have a look at that one. When we've run our identification workshop, it may be that we called people to a meeting either virtually or physically in person, where the agenda was first hour identification, second hour is then the prioritization. I should say assessment and prioritization, because you can't prioritize till you've assessed, and assess is about trying to put things on the scales. Now, if you can identify 30 risks in an hour, it might take you 10 minutes each to discuss them, assess them, and prioritize them. So it may be that you run a 40-minute identification session and then an hour and a half or 2 hour prioritization session, where you are prioritizing the risks that you've already partially prioritized. So I'm going to give you a golden rule, and I'm going to say that under some circumstances, when we get a bit further ahead, I'm going to advise you to break that rule. But the golden rule in identification was do not assess and prioritize, and the golden rule in prioritization is do not discuss responses. And you may just decide to do a little bit of that, but it's always a bad idea to disappear down a rabbit hole. What we need to be doing is going through our risks at a fairly brisk pace before we know which ones are really to be focused on. If you spend 40 minutes discussing risk number 3 and then you discover that risk number 7 is actually the most serious one, but you've run out of time to discuss it, you're in a bad place. So first things first, go through all your risks as quickly as possible, particularly if this is a continuation of an identification workshop, where the identification workshop has thrown up quite a few risks, more than you're going to be able to do in the prioritization workshop. Go through and do a bit of a triage and say which ones out of these do we want to discuss first. And our output from the session in total will be our risks ranked for significance. It may be that in doing that ranking, we identify new risks, or risks we have already identified, we discover that we didn't describe them clearly enough, and now we're trying to debate them. We find that our descriptions are not sufficient. One of the things about all risk management activities is that it's not until you get to the next step, step n+1, that you can tell whether the last step, n-1, was carried out well. Now, when you've got experience, you'll be able to make a better judgment. But when you haven't got a lot of experience, what you should always be reconciled to and not embarrassed about, and you should declare at the beginning of any session where you've got an audience participating with you, is we are going to move forwards and we are not afraid of moving backwards to recover things, but we're not going to debate in each step what should be done in the next step. But we might come back to a step that we've gone past in order to refine our result. So our purpose here is to create a ranked set of risks, and there are multiple different ways of doing that, which we'll talk about as we get into the tools and techniques. One of them is the probability impact grid or probability impact matrix, and I'll take you through the structure of one of those when we get to that later. This impact grid has along its top or its bottom and its left or its right the scales that we had previously identified, so that we can say this is a serious opportunity, or this is a serious threat, or this is an inconsequential threat. Pragmatism then often suggests that we are going to need to separate out our schedule risks from our health and safety risks, from our electrical engineering risks, from our product marketing risks, etc. And that means that we may do prioritization workshops on a basis of taking subject matter experts. So we might do identification as a group of people all together, and then split into you take those, you take those, and you take those, and work in 2s, 3s, or 30s, depending on how big your project is, to prioritize within work streams. Ultimately, it's all going to come down to where's the resource that's going to deliver the responses to the risks. So at this point, I'm beginning to think, what resources have I got with what skill sets, and what concerns have I got that impinge upon those skill sets? For example, how much of the risk prioritization does the sponsor need to do, because only they are in a position to say what they feel are the priorities. So we might need different grids at different levels of authority, so sponsor versus technical team, and we may need grids within different disciplines. What we are seeking to do is that we want to prioritize our risks, and we want to be confident that we've done a good job of that. So when we've got opportunity, because our groups are big enough, then split the group and get them to prioritize separately, and then come back and discuss with each other how they prioritized. And one of the techniques that we might do there is this bit here. When all the risks are positioned, we want to divide them into 2 groups. And the 2 groups are those that definitely need further treatment, and those that are definitely going to be put to one side until more time or resources available. And we almost certainly get a 3rd group, which is I'm not sure. In which case we put things into 3 groups. We put them into definitely doing something with this, definitely not doing something about this, and let's come back to them in a minute. And the let's come back to them in a minute, we're going to divide into definitely doing something with this and definitely not doing something with this. And I said earlier that I would talk to you about scales later, and a scale might be high, medium and low. And one of the reasons to not go with high, medium and low is because medium in the middle is always a problem. So one of the things that we might do is go with a 4-point scale, because that forces things to be above or below the middle. So we've run our prioritization workshop, and now we're ready to think about responses. So let's have a look at what a response workshop might look like. Response development workshops need subject matter expertise. You cannot decide what the response to a risk is if you don't understand the risks, causes and consequences from 2 perspectives. One is the perspective of the person who's going to be happy or hurt as a result of the consequences occurring, and from the perspective of the person who can do something about it. So this is really just an extension of standard planning, and it needs the same expertise as standard planning. You could call this backlog and sprint grooming. You could call this breakdown, structure decomposition, and activity network creation. It's basically the same activities in backlog grooming, sprint planning, and breakdown decomposition as we need to do in response development, although they are taking us, when we get to sprint planning and activity networks, we're getting to scheduling, and that's a little bit ahead of where we are here. Our purpose or our outputs here are to identify all of the causes and what we could do about them, and all of the conditions which lead to a consequence and what we could do about those, so that we have actions that could be taken. Now, it's been fairly cheap to deal with each risk up to this point. It's getting more expensive when we get into response development because of the time we're spending thinking about how we could respond. But the real costs arise when we then actually take the actions to deal with either the cause or the consequence. So it's wise to have the biggest volume of concerns as we can in the first step, to subject them to reasonable prioritization, first a triage and then some analysis, and then to identify with as much creativity and breadth of thinking as possible the responses that we can take, because now is the point at which we're actually going on. Next will be the point at which we're actually going to commit to spend some time and effort and therefore potentially some money. So what we want to know is for each cause and each consequence or the outcomes of the conditions, what the actions that we could take are, and then what those actions, costs, timing, participation, etc., etc., etc. are, because we're going to need to consider how they're going to impact our schedules and budgets and our business case, our benefits profile. So the change that taking an action will create in the project potentially affects all other aspects of the project. So when we think about the actions, the responses that we can take to a cause or a consequence, we have to think about the change in all cause, condition, consequences as a result of taking or not taking this action. I'll draw you some matrices, pictures later, but I take one action and it may easily affect multiple components of the project. Pragmatism suggests that every time I say all here, I really mean the ones that the people with the most authority care about the most. Actually, I don't probably mean the one that the people with the most authority care about the most. I mean the people with the most willingness to take action, which is not necessarily the people with the most authority. Because if I think I'm being threatened by something in your project, I will take action on my own behalf. If I think I'm being offered something attractive as a result of your project, then I might or might not take action. So the theory here is that when we find that we have causes and conditions, we think about all the responses, and when we think about the responses, we think about all of those responses, outcomes on everything else, and we do that from each stakeholder's perspective, and now we have something that's far too large to be practical. So I've said all, but I am going to guide you that some pragmatism is going to be needed there, and that pragmatism comes back to our conversation about people's emotions. It's the people who are most strongly emotionally affected who are going to be the most likely to take action, good or bad. So we need to think about that. So what we're going to do, in theory at least, is for all consequences, all causes and all consequences, ask the participants to think of things that we can do to promote opportunity or suppress threat, and we're going to use the same mechanism as previously. Silently identify 3 or more responses. You might choose 10 as your number. 3 is probably quite a large number if you've got a large number of risks. Again, this could have been done in advance of the meeting. So even if somebody's come up with a fragment like we might be late and they've not actually made it into a well-formed risk with why we might be late or what the consequences of that are, they may well still be able to identify the things we do as a result of being late. So you can invite people to the meeting and ask, please think of as many risks as possible, and please think of as many responses as possible. And when you get into the meeting and you brief them on what a good looking risk is and a good looking response, you'll still have content from them that can be put into the process. And when you put that content into your better than not clearly thought through set of steps, we'll end up with good outcomes, good outputs. Then share everybody's suggestions of cause and consequences, link all, again in inverted commas, of the causes and consequences with the potential responses, and all of the responses to all of the potential causes and consequences. So a two-way mapping. I will show you the graph. I didn't link it from this slide, but there's some modelling that we can do there. And ask the group then to think of some more responses. So I've suggested here 2 more. So now we've got 5 responses to every cause and every consequence. The numbers are multiplying very rapidly potentially here. So I'm again back to saying, if we can divide this by discipline, and if we can divide this by seniority of person required to authorize, then that may be a pragmatic way of having more coverage. We're going to have to do some identify the stuff that's highest priority first, if we are being faced with large numbers of combinations. And we need to do our record keeping, record the assessment of the risk. It was very concerning before we thought of the action. Now we've thought of this action. If we take the action successfully, it's not so concerning. So this is recording a reassessment, and there are 2 dimensions we'll talk about in a lot more detail later, which is secondary risk. That is, say, risks created by taking the action. So, for example, maybe my chief engineer might be about to resign. I think that's because of their pay and conditions. I improved their pay and conditions, and a whole bunch of other people come and knock on my door and say, I see you gave them a pay rise, where's mine? So I've now just created a secondary risk, and maybe the person I offered the pay rise to says, yeah, okay, I'll consider it, but I'm not completely convinced. So I haven't got rid of the risk in total. So secondary is risk we create, residual is risk that we have not yet got rid of. And notice how threat oriented that vocabulary is. And one of our challenges is that risk vocabulary, which we will get to shortly, is mostly threat oriented, although the theory in projects is that threat is opportunity, and risk is threat and opportunity. It's perhaps not quite so much the total reality. Now that's all very well, those steps that I've just been through there. So I hold a planning workshop, I get the scales, I get the sponsor bought in, I hold an identification workshop, get lots of concerns voiced, we put those into good format, and then we think about what could we do about each of those risks. And that's a nice tidy way to run risk workshops. It's very likely that I've been having conversations with people within the course of the project, or it's month 6 of the project, not month 1, and I'm having a conversation with somebody one-to-one, and we come across something that we think's a risk. So I need to reapply, or I need to apply all the things we've just talked about, but in a completely different context. So let's go and have a quick look at that one. Now, it's very common that rather than discussing our risks in a workshop, we're in a situation where we've gone to have a chat with somebody, perhaps somebody senior, and in that conversation we get some sort of fragment. So we might, for example, get a cause stated while I'm thinking of moving some resources around, without the impact then having been part of that sentence as well. Or maybe we've got an impact that gets raised in a conversation, and we need in that one-to-one conversation really to hold the whole of the risk assessment process. So very common to hold a conversation that's going to go through starting with a fragment, key there, accept fragments of any form, and then encourage the conversation to then follow through the steps of what might cause that, or what might the consequences of that be, and how might we deal about that. So, as I've said several times now, and I will say it when we get into the tools and techniques, accept fragments in any format that you get them at any time, willingly and gratefully, but don't take them forward through the process until you have asked the so what does that mean, or the how could that happen conversations, had the so who else would care about this. So I'm talking to somebody and they're greatly upset about something that might happen, and I say who else cares, and they say nobody else. And then my stakeholder analysis bit says, okay, and you don't have an awful lot of power, So I'm definitely going to put it in the risk backlog, the risk register, but I'm not going to progress it very far, but you might want to. We also need to then be able to say, so where would this fall on the scales? It might be that they have not been part of any conversation prior to this that has discussed the scales, so they might not know what the scales mean. So I may need to share what the scales are, and the more those scales are descriptive rather than numeric, the more meaningful that conversation will be. I also need to consider whether the reality is this person doesn't really need to justify what they think. I just need to do what they say because the politics is such that that's where they are in the organisation. So does the politics provide a means of prioritisation that is outside of the tidy mechanics of running a nicely facilitated risk process that conforms to the standards that are corporate governance and PMO and everything else within the organisation has published? Well, probably at one level I should be saying there is no such thing as riding roughshod over all of that, but quite often I know that something is important because of who it came from. I don't need to go and have a look at lots of other process. Always, when we are talking risk in any circumstance, but particularly the one-to-one, consider the business case and all aspects of the baselines. If I'm talking to the business, then they're interested in outcome. If I'm talking to the development community, then they're interested in the cost, time, performance. That is scope and quality triangle. And if they're an agile group, they've got the triangle one way up, which is we've got a fixed amount of time now, how much scope can we cover? And if I'm talking to a waterfall community, they've got the triangle the other way up, which is we've got to deliver this scope. Now, how much resource do we need for it? But both of those are bearing on the business case, and we will later go and have more conversation about what it looks like to understand how to describe the impact on the business case and the responses that would be appropriate. So where might we be on the scales, both pre and post? Now, if I've gone off and gone into a conversation and a context where somebody has said I'm doing something or I'm thinking of or something or is of concern, and I've had that conversation over the table or over the Skype link, and I've got some information captured, and this could be anybody in the project team at any level, then we need to bring it back and share it with the rest of the community. So update the risk register when practical, inform the relevant folk as is practical, and then make sure that the mechanisms are assigning ownership. So as we talk through what the causes and the consequences are, and therefore the responses that could be taken, either preventative or promotional or recovery or to take advantage, then we need to understand who's going to be doing that. So that's the ownership. Expect that the response development selection, etc., is then integrated into baselines. So if we're in a waterfall environment, it's in the Gantt chart, it's in the resource profiles. If we're in an agile environment, then items of the sprint backlog, or indeed perhaps the product backlog, are actually pushed down in our priorities a bit, because there are other things that we need to do that are higher priority calls on the resources that are available to us. So that's all the steps. There are a couple of things that we still need to talk about, because all of that was revolving around record keeping. So let's just have a quick discussion about record keeping before we're at the end of this module. Important that we do our record keeping. Now, I will say it again later and explore it in more detail. Risk management is not about keeping records, but risk management doesn't really work if you don't keep some records. So we've got routine oversight of the register, and that routine oversight of the register has a feed from all the things that we've already talked about, and one other thing that we haven't talked about, which is the routine repeat of activities in order to be monitoring our evolving risk situation. So we're going to need to keep an eye on the risks that are in the list, and we're also going to need to add things to the list that we hadn't previously seen. And we're never going to delete things from the list, but we are going to mark things in the list as no longer of concern to us. So we need routine oversight of our register. Might be being done by a PMO analyst or a project manager, and we could consider that register as a backlog of stuff that we may do, because the risk process is gather everything that we could do together, stick it in the register, and then for the stuff that is worth doing, move it into people's to-do lists. That is either the sprint backlog or the Gantt chart and whatever other mechanism you use for allocating people to tasks. It comes back to awareness and actions, and that awareness and action needs to be in everybody's thinking all of the time. And when they have an action to take, or they or some awareness arises in them, we want that to end up in our memory, which for projects is the post-it notes stuck on the Kanban board, or for the project, or it's in the sprint backlog, or wherever we keep that information. And in doing that routine register oversight and the awareness bit, the oversight is asking everybody, are you progressing the things that you should be? Is there anything that you need my help with in order to progress them? So are you okay, and do you need my help? Those are better questions than what have you done, and have you done everything you should have done? Are you okay? Yes, no. In fact, you might even ask the questions the other way around. Do you need my help? And okay, so everything's all right then. So we also need to ask, am I, and all the other stakeholders, giving and receiving appropriate 360-degree support? So routine register oversight, and this goes for every component of the project, is about asking people, do you need my help? Am I giving you the support that you need? And am I getting the support I need? And each hierarchical level of any control structure should be doing that. Each team in the project should be caring for their local subset of risks. So that's the sponsor caring for some risks, and it's the technician or maybe even the T person caring for theirs. And in looking at the register, we should be asking, in caring for their local subset of risks, are they updating the register? Are they saying things like, we've looked at this risk and we're not going to do anything more with it? So if there's been no new update, no recent updates or no new entries, then that says to me that the record keeping isn't going on. And if the record keeping isn't going on, is the actions going on? If actions going on and record keeping isn't, then I'm not hugely upset, depending on the formality. If we're building a nuclear reactor, I'm probably pretty upset all ways round. If we're creating a new website and people are getting on and creating it and it's a very small team, then I'm maybe a lot less upset. But if I'm seeing no entries in the register at all, I can't be confident that people are actually taking the actions. If I go and ask them and they are, then that's the most important component. So confirm adequate risk awareness and understanding of process by seeing the register get updated on a routine basis. Otherwise, confirm no progress, no status change means no action. Also, check fragments are being progressed as far as consensus on worthwhile. So if I look at the register and it's got a whole bunch of stuff like we may be late, and I go and ask people and they go, yeah, we thought we did actually kick that one about, we did talk it through, and actually we ended up with 3 new entries which are much more specific, then I'm happy to leave the fact that I have entries in the register that are thought provokers, but they are not yet action provokers because the action is elsewhere. So in total, it's, are the records kept, and are those records moving forwards for as far as it's worthwhile? So if people stopped, for example, we got this risk, we didn't think it was very serious, and we haven't got enough resources to go and deal with it, and since it's not serious, we parked it to one side, then I'm happy with that. I'm going to check that response owners, those people named somewhere in my to-do lists and plans, are fluent on the actions that they are coordinating. They know what's going on. The owners have the right authority to be able to push the actions forwards, that they're not aware of an opportunity that can't be realised or a threat that's not being dealt with because they can't get other people to take action. That is to say, in total, that actions are happening, and those actions that are happening are actually within my baseline sprint backlog, or they're within my baseline other forms of plan. That is to say, plans are fed from the risk process, not we're trying to manage the project from multiple different sources, one of which is the change log, another of which is the risk log, etc. That ends up being more difficult than if we treat the risk register as a source of actions to be copied into the project plan, however the project plan is run. I mean, the project plan, if the project plan's a Kanban board, that's fine. Just make sure if somebody's going to spend some time working on risk, we understand how that resource is being modelled. If we are resource constrained, which I guess most of us normally are, we should be asking the question, would more or indeed less resource spent in different areas like risk logging or risk actions have an effect on the business case? And if so, we should be going to talk to whoever owns that business case and talking about, you know what, if we spent less time doing documentation, we'd spend more time creating results, or equally, if we had more people, we'd spend more time dealing with our challenges or realizing our opportunities. So is the balance correct? So routine register oversight is going to say, is the log being updated? And if it is, then I can have some confidence stuff's going on. And if it isn't, I'm going to go and investigate. And when I investigate, the question is, are all the people who could be supporting in the right way or not? And the last question that I'm going to examine on this slide, we've got one more to go in a second, is to say that if I'm doing the risk oversight, then I should expect somebody, perhaps in a progress meeting, but perhaps just in the queue at the canteen, to say what's going on. And I should be able to give the 20-second, maybe it's 5 minutes, but I should be able to give the elevator pitch that says this is where we currently are and what's of most appeal and of what's of most concern. I should be able to say where the information is that would follow up. So I might be able to say, yes, there is a large concern. Its description is this. If you want the details, then this is where you'll have to look, or I'll bring them to you. So points to, or a pointer to where the detailed information is, and that's going to be our backlog or register, and I'll take you through that stuff when we get to slide 64. But what I want to do now is the very last thing, which is to say, if I'm doing oversight of the register, then that typically tells me things like, yeah, we've taken some action, they're not sufficient, or we've discovered a new risk and we haven't taken any action on it yet. So we're going to have to run that routine workshop that is about what are we going to do next with risk, and is probably just an agenda item in some other sort of forum like the daily stand-up meeting or the weekly progress meeting. But let's go and have a look at what that looks like. I might, on a daily basis, but definitely on some form of regular basis, run a monitoring and response selection workshop where I ask questions like, should we continue as we are, or should we do something different? So I had a risk, maybe it was a threat, I've been taking action, it looks like that threat is unlikely to occur, or if it did occur I would no longer be quite so concerned about it, so I'm going to stop. So what I've done is I've run a session where we've consciously decided no more threat response actions are required, or it might be that somebody has identified a new risk, it's gone through the steps of identification, prioritization and response development, and now we need to say, well, we've got some time and capacity, it would be well worth inserting that into our to-do lists, into our actions. When we get to the conversation about what actions are we going to take, we've already had the conversation that says these need to be led by the impact owner, primarily the sponsor at the higher level, During that planning session that we talked about earlier, they will have delegated some degree of authority. We will have people with particular roles because of their subject matter expertise, and therefore they can be the people who will do the monitoring and response selection, which is saying, should we put responses aside, or should we add extra responses or swap responses for new ones? So primarily the sponsor or their delegated authority examines all open risks, again all should be in quotes here, and selects the responses that are inside our authority or escalates those responses that are outside of our authority. And that's a very important component of the initial planning conversations that we had that talk about who is the point of escalation from one person to another, and how do we do the escalation to somebody who's technical, which is very often called delegation, in order that we can get a good solution combined with the authority to deploy it. The outputs of all of this are going to be adjusted baseline intentions, so an adjusted sprint activity. So running the routine monitoring may actually be a component of a daily stand-up meeting. It may be a component of a weekly progress meeting. It may be a component of a sprint planning session where we're looking at risks that were around from the previous sprint. In total, what we're looking at is what's our risk profile, how should it be adjusted? And so we consider each risk's current position as of today versus where the project wants to end up as of today, and adjust as necessary by weighing the current assessment against all of the draws on demand of resource. Select the appropriate responses from the register and integrate those into either, as I've already said, sprint backlog or the network schedule, and compare and reevaluate all of the impacts for all stakeholders on all aspects of the business case. And in all cases there, all was probably too strong, and what I really meant was significant. But determining significance is not always easy, but certainly dealing with all is normally prohibitively expensive beyond the resources that we've got. That's a conversation that needed to be had during the planning workshop with the sponsor at the beginning, and I will come back to when we get to the planning discussions, which are actually right at the end of the course. Okay, now we have a view of what the routine activities that I would be doing as either PMO facilitator or project manager, program manager, etc. in terms of running the risk process. We should actually define what a risk is, get some definition down, and then we should go step by step through the techniques and tools that allow us to put all those processes and steps that I've taken you through now into operation. So you might want to take a breather. Let's go and dive into the concepts, their vocabulary, the tools and their techniques, or should I say that the other way around, the techniques and their tools, and the step-by-step exploration.